Valve left a huge amount of performance on the table with its single channel configuration for the Steam machine, meaning that it has one stick of memory in, and that's a 16 gigabyte stick. They're not occupying all the channels available. In some of our tests today, that means upwards of 20% performance gains that Valve could have had if they went with 2 sticks instead. The no bullshit TLDR up front is that in the worst case, Valve's decision to ship with a single stick leaves an overwhelming 19% of performance improvement on the table in file compression testing, a 15% frame rate increase in Baldur's Gate 3 at our CPU test settings, and still about 9% when using higher graphic settings, a 10% increase in Resident Evil 4 performance in CPU bound testing, a 15% increase in the Outer Worlds 2 at low, 2.5% in Stellaris simulation time testing, and then in GPU bound testing, we mostly see 0 to 3% differences, which makes sense because in those situations, we target the GPU rather than the CPU and the system memory. It's really those big numbers, though, in the CPU limited testing that show how much Valve has fucked the performance by opting for a single stick, which is something we haven't even seen system integrators do for, well, I guess we saw it for Alienware, but since then, it's been a while. So we're testing that today. Now, due to the stability and the post issues we had with one of the kits of memory we bought to test this single versus dual channel configuration content for, we had to wait until we could get a kit that was basically an exact match to Valve's included kit, which obviously involved opening it, identifying it, and then ordering the closest possible thing we could find, just because mixing and matching memory or deviating from the spec with memory can often result in stability issues. But we have it now. Before that, this video was brought to you by the Antec Vortex View 360 liquid cooler, which includes a rotatable 1280 by 720 5-inch display with RGB back glow that casts a spotlight right onto the empty RAM slots in your motherboard. Antec focuses on usability with the cooler, with flexible sleeved tubing, an easily positionable screen, and pre-installed paste with easy-to-use mounting hardware for installation. Antec also says it focused on tuning the pump noise level down with its Vortex View for silence. Learn more at the link in the description below. Our original Valve interview stated that Steam machines would ship with either 1 or 2 sticks, seemingly randomly.
The memory that's populated in the slots, like, you know, at some point you might have 2 DIMMs, at some point you might have 1. It just changes based on the supply that we can secure. But at the end of the day, it should be comparable speeds and all that.
Okay, yeah, just to be clear, basically, the system memory is 16 gigabytes. But again, to be able to build as many as we can, we have to essentially have some with 1 stick, 16, some with 2 sticks of 8. I mean, we validated the performance delta. We don't really think it makes a big difference, or if any measurable difference at all. I mean,
for game work.
For games work.
If you're doing, you know, workstation stuff, the memory stuff, we understand that dual channel has a difference there, but it's either that or all the machines that, you know, have 1 slots, we couldn't have shipped them. But so like, I think it's worth the trade-off, but that's definitely, and we have to just take the supply that comes in.
That's a quote directly from Valve. Those who saw our teardown know that Valve emailed us later to correct itself. So to be clear, this was Valve correcting its own statement. It said this, quote, "In our interview, we mentioned that some Steam machines may come with 1 16 gigabyte stick of RAM and others with 2 8 gigabyte sticks of RAM. We misspoke here. All units will actually have 1 16 gigabyte stick of RAM. It's possible that this might change in future builds, but the units that customers are currently signing up for will all come with 1 16 gigabyte stick of RAM," end quote. We followed up with that to ask Valve if it changes that in the future, if it would tell people, or if it would just be a silent change. So Valve did answer us now. They said, quote, "If we do ever change the configuration, we will make sure it's clear to customers what version they're buying. Hope that helps," end quote. So in other words, if they go from single stick to 2 sticks shipping, then based on what they're saying here, they'll make sure that's publicly known. The good news is, if you rolled out of bed today and said, "Jeeves, check my coffers and see if I have an extra $1,000, and you're buying one of these, then you know what you're getting, which is a single stick of RAM. And then I suppose you could ask Jeeves to also go ahead and spend another $200+ to buy you a second stick of RAM. And if that's the situation, then congratulations on your generational wealth. But the bad news is that it is the worst possible configuration they could ship, which is a single channel of memory being used. And this is something that we don't really see that much anymore. So you could spin this as a positive by saying it leaves room for an upgrade, which is sort of true. But as many of us have experienced, mixing and matching memory is a recipe for stability problems. And it might be fine today, but in like a year and a half, when you launch some random application and the whole system crashes, it's not really going to be clear if it's because you mixed and matched the memory or some other problem. So really, we would, it's notoriously sensitive to mix and match sticks. And it really we wouldn't advise it. And we can't guarantee what the stick would be either, so it might not match the one we got, which is because supply is a nightmare to navigate and Valve has no control over the memory cartels. Valve says it chose to ship this way because that's what enabled them to get more supply available. We believe that claim because Valve, as it said, doesn't have a contract with the memory suppliers. Were you able to lock in kind of contracts for memory with the suppliers directly, or did you have to jump through a bunch of hoops? Or
look, there's no contracts, there's nothing. Yeah. Like those guys, they are, you know, they give us a price every month or something, and they say you can buy that many, and it's yes or no. And if we say no, then they never talk to us again, right?
It seems what Valve has instead from the memory suppliers is a take it or go fuck yourself agreement. We're not sure what the 2x8 gigabyte supply was, but normally it isn't as simple as deciding to allocate your memory supply to a single 16 gigabyte stick versus two 8 gigabyte sticks in the current market. It depends on what the vendors had available and what they were making anyway. Regardless, from the information we have, Valve is presenting that its choice was to either reduce the amount of Steam machines it had available by putting 2 sticks in the Steam machines, or shipping a nerfed Steam machine out of the box that leaves possibly a lot of performance on the table in some situations. And you know, compression's not like a weird test. That's something you do all the time just by using the computer. So our argument would be that it's better to ship it right than to do something where you're leaving 20% of the performance on the table in some situations. But if you look closer, there is one additional hurdle. This marking on the stick of RAM in our build means that this stick was built in 2026. Valve was buying 2026 inventory for these, which means we need to correct ourselves. Valve doesn't have a take it or go fuck yourself agreement. Valve has a get fucked and go fuck yourself anyway agreement with SK Hynix apparently, where this memory was likely sold near its peak price this year. So anyway, our focus is on performance of going 1 versus 2 sticks today. So we finally had a chance to thoroughly test this. It takes a long time to run all the benchmarks we do, especially in SteamOS, because it's fully manual for us, as opposed to where in Windows we can do a lot more automated testing, but we've gotten it done. We had a few main concerns going into this testing. First, we weren't sure if getting access to the memory initially would require removing the heatsink, and we didn't want to disturb the heatsink during the review process for a few obvious reasons. One of them is we try to not disassemble things until we are 100% done with testing, because if something goes wrong, then you're fucked and you can't do anything about it. But the other reason is we don't want to disturb the thermal interface material and end up in a situation where we've messed with the thermal results or the acoustic results in a way that would make it no longer representative of the box out of the box. So that was the first concern. Now, fortunately, as we learned in our teardown after the review, the RAM can be accessed without removing the heatsink. That's a good thing. Unfortunately, you do have to remove almost every single other thing, and the flex cables attaching the I/O are glued down to form fit and could easily be torn if you're not careful. Now, if you know about that, which those of you watching this now do, it's not a problem. But this is one of those types of devices where it's not hard to get access if you relatively know what you're doing, but a novice definitely should be careful with it. Now, the second concern we had for this testing was the main one, which is that we needed the kit to match Valve's spec as much as we could. Our first attempt at a 2-stick replacement kit yielded issues with post. We're not sure if that was due to the RAM we bought or due to the Steam machine itself, but we ended up just matching our existing 16 gigabyte stick, as that seemed easier. So we matched the ranks, the timings, and the speed, but we had one difference that we needed to account for in our testing methodology today, which was the capacity. That's different. So our initial attempt involved 2 8 gigabyte sticks. Those were the ones where we couldn't post. The second attempt, which was sort of our Hail Mary, let's just see if this works, was using the included 16 gigabyte stick and adding a basically matched 16 gigabyte stick. And that seems to have solved the problem with booting, but now we have a capacity mismatch from stock. Now, the way to solve this, fortunately, is pretty easy. Our testing suite today doesn't exceed the 16 gigabyte pool of memory, the 16 gigabyte capacity, which means that the differences we're gonna see are going to be from the channeling rather than from the capacity. I will caveat this to say that with SteamOS, this is all true. We weren't exceeding the 16 gigabyte capacity. Now, if we were to do this testing in Windows, which we're not, this might be a different story, because Windows is a gluttonous, inefficient monster that will eat like 9 gigabytes of RAM for no reason whatsoever. And so it might be a problem there, but it wasn't for our testing today. All right, so memory channels. The CPU architecture and the platform dictate how many memory channels are available in a computer. And the amount of memory sticks in the right slot specifically dictates whether you can actually tap into and use what the CPU architecture and the CPU itself, the memory controller, and the motherboard make available. So if you have a dual channel platform with 4 slots, then you can get 2 channels by using either 2 specific slots or all 4 slots. You'd be on 1 channel with either 1 stick or with 2 sticks in the ROM slots, such as adjacent. This is different from double data rate or DDR, where data transacts twice per clock. A DDR5 module also has 2 independent 32-bit channels rather than a single 64-bit channel, but this is for efficiency. It doesn't mean that one stick is running in true platform-level dual channel, which in this case would be 4 32-bit channels. The CPU and its memory controller have their own spec dictating that aspect, and Valve's Steam Machine motherboard and Zen 4 CPU can run dual channel if both slots are occupied. With 1 stick present only, and with half the channels being occupied, you're cutting the total bandwidth significantly, although it won't typically manifest in a 1-to-1 loss in actual real-world performance, but it can be a lot. Dual channel means 2 modules can be simultaneously read from or written to via the memory controller. Let's get into the testing today. We have some CPU targeted tests, some GPU targeted tests, pretty simple stuff. Let's get to it. 7-zip compression is a CPU-heavy test that measures performance in millions of instructions per second, and it doesn't load the GPU. In this benchmark, the base Steam Machine out of the box hit 55,000 MIPS in the file compression test that had it alongside the AMD R7 2700 and AMD R5 3600, so in the range of Zen Plus and Zen 2, nowhere near the performance of desktop Zen 4 parts like the R5 7600, which outperformed the Steam Machine by 60%. Now, a lot of that is from the power budget changes that Valve made to fit it into the box and the power envelope that they have, but as we see here, a lot of it is also from the memory choices. This test doesn't exceed the 16GB capacity, so adding extra capacity will not meaningfully affect the results. Adding a second stick of memory brought us up to 66,000 MIPS, an improvement of about 19%. Valve has substantially hamstrung the performance of its CPU by choosing a single stick of memory. File compression and decompression are both tasks people do all the time, whether you realize it or not, like when installing software, for example. So there's a real-world performance impact from this. The new score has it between a 5500X3D and 5600X3D, which is far more suitable and 1 Zen generation ahead of the R5 3600 comparison. In decompression testing, the Steam Machine ran at 67,000 MIPS stock, improving to 68,516 MIPS with the extra stick. Decompression is less affected than compression, showing a 1.6% improvement. This matches what we've seen in our CPU benchmarks over the years, where a lot of times in decompression testing we don't see as much impact from memory. That improvement is valid, but it doesn't bring it up past the ancient R7 2700 from 2018, so it doesn't really meaningfully change anything. The machine remains at around Zen Plus levels in this test. We also know from past testing that Baldur's Gate 3 in this configuration doesn't exceed 16 gigabytes of system memory. With this test, keep in mind this is also with SteamOS, not with Windows, so we don't have to deal with all that overhead. In the benchmark, the Steam Machine ran at 60 FPS with lows at 35 and 29. Going beyond just one channel got us to 69 FPS average, 41 for 1% lows, and a substantial improvement to 37 in the 0.1% lows, which represents better frame-to-frame consistency. In average FPS alone, we measured a 15% uplift in performance of the second stick. We validated this data in additional test runs. It's a substantial change, and it has a meaningful impact to the results. Valve's choice to go with a single stick of RAM is definitely harming its performance substantially in some, but not all, of these tests, and that includes some of the gaming. In Resident Evil 4, we measured the default Steam Machine at 118 FPS average and the memory channel upgrade at about 130 FPS average. The second channel improved performance by about 10%. From our check here, it looks like this is unrelated to capacity in this test once again. 1% performance also improved for the lows, moving from 78 to 86. 0.1% lows also slightly improved. In Black Myth WuKong at 1080p low, the machine didn't show much difference between the two variations. The results were about 74 FPS average for both, with lows also comparable. This game is also heavier on the GPU though, so it looks like the memory channeling limitation isn't our primary bottleneck. Stellaris is next. This is another CPU benchmark, and it's a great one actually, because this one is focused on CPU simulation time rather than frame rate. The Steam Machine originally required 67.4 seconds. The original testing had the Steam Machine between the R7 3700X and R5 3600. Adding a stick of RAM didn't have much impact. The improvement was a reduction in simulation time of 2.4%. Again, in this test, the capacity appears to be unrelated to the slight performance uplift. This was from the channeling. We test the Outer Worlds 2 with CPU and GPU bound settings. This is the test CPU bound. In this test, the original Steam machine ran at 64.4 FPS average, about 49.1% low, and 41.0.1% low. That had it almost perfectly matched with the ancient R5 3600 CPU. Adding a second stick of RAM improved performance to 75 FPS average, or about a 16% uplift. Lows also improved at 64 for 1% and 53 for 0.1%. The new result is around 5600X levels of performance, so we've gained an entire generation's worth of performance uplift by comparison to desktop by using all available memory channels. This is substantial, and Valve should be shipping with the correct configuration. They said it reduced supply, which we are understanding of, but this is a lot of performance to leave on the table, and is similar to what we witnessed with pre-built gaming PCs underutilizing hardware. Upgrading is likewise not optimal because it's not ideal to mix and match sticks due to risk of instability. Also, it's not particularly trivial to get into the RAM. It's really not that difficult. Anyone in our audience, I think, could handle it. But for the average end user who hasn't opened a computer before, there's a risk they shear a cable or something like that. Basically, it'd be better to just ship it with 2 sticks of RAM. We also test Starfield with GPU and CPU settings. This is the CPU-focused test. The original Steam machine result was at the bottom of the chart, down at 65 FPS average. Unlike the other tests that we've talked about so far for the most part, this game did actually show a slight improvement from one of Valve's operating system updates in between the review and now. We ran validation against all the games, but most were the same. This one jumped from 65 to 71 FPS average, or a 10% improvement from Valve's SteamOS updates since the days before the review went live. We were able to validate this. This pushed the stock Steam machine past the embarrassing result of the R5 2600 batch, at least just barely, and landed it around still the embarrassing result of other Zen Plus CPUs like the 2700, but it's at least marginally better than it was before. The like-for-like number is 71.4 FPS average, not the 64.8 here. Using that number, the extra channel improved to 73, so that's a 2.7% improvement. Not much, but present. In Blender cycles rendering on the CPU, we didn't see a meaningful impact to performance from the memory configuration change, which makes sense here. Rendering this frame in Blender isn't very memory intensive, it's more thread bound. We'll move over to the GPU bound testing now. These are unlikely to as heavily depend on the memory channels given the GPU bottleneck hitting first. In Dragon's Dogma 2, the Steam machine hit 52.2 FPS average and 52.5 with the memory change. We're within error, so there's no impact. Final Fantasy XIV Dawn Trail saw the Steam machine at 86 FPS average stock and 87 with the channels fully utilized. The results are the same and within error. In Resident Evil 4 with GPU-focused testing, the Steam machine saw a slight improvement of 3.4% in average FPS. Validation indicates this is from populating all channels. In Baldur's Gate 3 at 1080p Ultra, so our GPU testing settings, the Steam machine originally ran at 55 FPS average and had lows at 37 and 32. Those numbers improved with all channels occupied, increasing 8.7% from baseline. It's one of the larger improvements we've seen and indicates that Valve has left a lot on the table in some of these tests with its single-stick configuration. Cyberpunk 2077 put the Steam machine at about the same frame rate between them. We did have overall less consistent frame-to-frame interval pacing in one of the runs for stock, causing lower overall average 0.1% results. But it looks like it's more due to general inconsistency in this test on SteamOS with the machine, rather than from the channeling specifically. So they're about the same. In Black Myth WuKong with our 1080p high GPU settings, we saw about a 1 FPS change between the two entries. It's repeatable and appears to be a real improvement, but it's obviously just not that noteworthy versus the CPU limited tests. In Starfield with our GPU settings, we saw a 1.5 FPS average improvement, or a 3.6% uplift by going to both slots occupied. Lows improve in step, but it's still the worst device on the charts by frame time consistency, including the 3050. Remember though that these aren't perfectly like for like, as we have SteamOS on the machine and Windows for the rest of the devices, plus the higher end CPU for the GPU testing. But that's more of what our review is for, so we're not going to go back over all that again. The rest of the tests are about the same outcome. Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 with Ultra settings saw no difference. The Outer Worlds 2 likewise was about the same for the GPU, and so on with the rest. All right, so Valve really nerfed the performance of the Steam machine in some testing that we did with a single stick of RAM, single channel, rather than going for 2 channels. So some of the best examples include file compression, which again, it's not like this is some arcane weird thing you do. This happens when you use a computer. There's a lot of tasks that are compression. Decompression. Compression was impacted more heavily in our testing. That was the biggest number. It was somewhere around 90% improvement left on the table with 2 sticks. And again, we made sure that was not exceeding the capacity. It was actually pretty far under. And then in Baldur's Gate, we also saw a 15% improvement in the CPU bound or CPU targeted testing, and still close to 10% with GPU targeted higher graphics testing. So there's places where the numbers are pretty fucking big that they're leaving out for the performance, actual additional headroom if they had gone with 2 sticks. Now again, Valve's defense to this is, well, if we shipped with 2 sticks, then we wouldn't have as many Steam machines available, which is believable because there are 3 companies that sell memory that Valve can actually get access to. And of those 3 companies, one of them just said that it has 16 customers in the world who are important enough to have long-term agreements and contracts, like really long-term, like a couple years, or 3 to 5 years. Micron, we just published a video on this, and Valve is, I can almost 100% guarantee you, not one of those customers, because they said they have 4 big ones, probably NVIDIA, maybe Apple, not sure on the other 2, maybe hyperscalers, maybe Microsoft, maybe OpenAI, not really sure. But the point is, the memory cartel seems to be alive and well. And I guess you take what you get, and if you don't want to take it because you don't like the price, then fuck you, we'll sell it to someone else, based on what Valve said to us in their interview. So their defense for shipping it like this is, as they've presented, just the quantity of them. Now, the way we look at it is this is a lot of performance to leave on the table, and I really don't like the idea that in the future they might just, okay, it's 2 sticks now, because now you've got customers who have bought the single stick system who get the worst product, and you also have customers who might not know when or if it switches over, and they're trying to make plans for, or maybe they have a specific configuration they want, because either they want to add a stick or they want to make sure they never have to open the thing ever, and it has 2 sticks already. Anyway, with the limitations of this device, in more heavily GPU-bound scenarios, you are unlikely to be affected by the memory channeling as much. So again, in the GPU-targeted testing, we saw 0 to like 3.5% or something performance change. In CPU-targeted, mixed bag, but it's got the bigger numbers. And if you're doing anything that's non-gaming at all, that's where it really starts to matter in some of the applications. Not all, but like if you were to compile Chromium or something, which we haven't run that test on it yet because it would take 2 days. But if you were to do something like that, it probably would start to come into play. I'd have to run it, obviously, but I'm fairly certain that that would be a big impact for single versus dual. We would need to lock down the capacity for that test because that one does use capacity if you give it to it. So that we'd have to match the capacity for, and I need to buy more sticks and try to get them to work. But anyway, that's kind of it. If you are buying one of these and you want to put memory in, I guess the thing I would caution is if you are going to open it, be really careful with the flex cables. They are glued to the side of the heatsink. I talked about that in the teardown. Not a fan of that. They're trying to get it to be as pulled together so I think it doesn't tug on the chassis when you're socketing it, because then it would definitely tear. But the glue is not hard. Just do a really slow peel to remove it. I guess you could heat gun it, but the way it's done, it is tacky enough that you'll be able to reapply it without issues. If you kind of get in there, get your work done, and put it all back together, it'll stay glued down, unlike a lot of other glue. If you heat gun it, it might not. But do a really slow pull on it, and don't yank on the heatsink area, like the top side PCB and heatsink, until you're sure the cables are disconnected, because that will shear a cable. You don't have to take the heatsink off. You can flip it and then get access to the memory underneath, but you do have to take it out of the box and disassemble most of the device to get there. So really kind of unfortunate mix of things where it's like, because they went with a single stick, if this were like you flip it over and then you take the 4 feet out and then you've just got access to the memory slots, not nearly as big a deal from an assembly perspective. Anyone could do that. But the way they've done it, like, it's not hard to take apart, but I'm trying to just be cognizant of people who maybe have never taken apart a console or even a computer, which is probably the more likely target audience for this type of thing, and just caution those people to be careful, because it wouldn't be too hard to fuck it up if you're a little reckless with it. So that's it. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more. Go to store.camerasnexus.net to help us out directly, like by buying one of our PC building anti-static mod mats, and we will see you all next time.